what I'm going to talk about today, briefly, a brief look at the shipbuilding and the shipbuilders who have operated at Chester since 1700. And this picture, this shows the area where the port of Chester was in the 1700s. And some of you, or maybe all of you, are familiar with that area. This picture was used for the cover of my book, and it's the only contemporary picture of the 18th of the age of sail in the port of Chester that I've been able to find. And this picture is in the Grosvenor Museum. It's unattributed, but it is, I think, a nice picture of the port. Not so much the shipyard, but it does sort of show what the area looked like then. And the area we're talking about, of course, is the area it's on the east side of the river at this point and backs onto New Crane Street and what has become Sealand Road and the way to the retail park. But you can see the other interesting thing in the picture is on the left. The ship on the left is loading at the cheese stage. Cheese was a very important traffic in Chester in the 18th century. This shows the area on a map done in 1796, and you can see that the river is the area talking about is between the river and New Crane Street, along what is at that point, I say, the east side of the river. And you can see there are a number of inlets off the river at this point then, and it shows them called the Old Crane and the New Crane. And these inlets, I think, were used probably some ships were built in those inlets, and they were used as they were closed to the tide by various temporary means, and were used to repair ships and build ships. And you can see there are other things are shown on that picture, the workhouse, and not particularly marked there. There was also an iron foundry and quite a lot of timber yards. So it was a typical port area. But of course, Chester, the River Dee, notoriously has silted up, and it had already by this time, by the late 18th century, it was already silting up, and they tried to they straightened the river out in 1737, the long straight section, which is to the runs from the top left of the picture as we're looking at it. That had all been done in 1737, and it was already silting up, and it was a big issue, was ships actually getting to Chester. Even the ships of the size used for trade at that time, it was a struggle, or it was becoming a struggle. This is either a late 19th or early 20th century picture of the port area. You can see there isn't much activity by that time. And some of those buildings in the background, the ones on the right, are still there, which were used as warehouses. But there's very little activity. Really, as far as Chester being a port, through the late 18th and through the 19th century up until 1870, shipbuilding was quite an important part of the port activity. There wasn't a lot of the other port activity associated with the River Dee is further downriver, and is in the Queen's Ferry, Connors Quay, and Flint, and the industrial areas down there. And in fact, some of the trade coming to Chester ships were lightened and brought cargoes up to Chester on barges. The ships were lightened at like off Flint and things like that in the 19th century because of the dredging, shallowness. So shipbuilding became relatively important to Chester because, of course, when you build a ship and you launch it, it's got no cargo in it, so it's quite light draft. So you can sail it in and out of the port quite easily, but you'll probably never ever see it in Chester again because it's loaded. It would be too big to come back there. So, as I say, it became relatively important. This is the shipbuilding, the main shipbuilding area as it looks today, and you can see the railway bridge in the background. And after the railway bridge was put up in 1846, the shipbuilding area was restricted to what would be the north side of that railway bridge. It didn't extend onto the River Dee, onto the Rue Dee. So you can see today it's nice apartments. The riverbank has been, well, not the particular part you can see there so much, but it has been sheet piled and the slipways have disappeared. So it's quite different. There is a part of, you can, if you walk around there and you look hard amongst the weeds, you can see one slipway still surviving. So shipbuilding was important, but the rest of the port had declined really, and of course Liverpool was in the ascendancy as a trading point. The cheese was still important. But until 1828, there weren't really ships built anywhere else on the River Dee. They were only built at Chester before that point, in all seriousness. A few were built at Parkgate, probably less than 20, but there were a few proper ships built at Parkgate. There was a yard. There were one yard at the south end of Parkgate and one yard at the north end of Parkgate for a time, and they built proper sailing ships. So let us have, right, so this picture, which I took, this was taken at Paynes Hill Park near Staines in Surrey. This is a picture of a typical sort of ship that would have been built at Chester in the latter part of the 19th century. And really, shipbuilding only took off after 1750, partly because encouraged by the endless Napoleonic wars later on, and also, of course, 1750 is considered to be the start of the Industrial Revolution. So it's those two things which led to the growth. And this would be the sort of bigger ship that was built at Chester at this time. A ship being a sailing vessel with 3 masts, all with square sails, as that one is. So, for instance, between 1750 and 1800, there was something like 225 ships built at Chester that I've found. There may well be more. 51 of them were ships that looked like that one, and a lot of them were smaller vessels, mainly brigs and brigantines. And if anybody's interested, a brig is a 2-masted vessel, square rigged on 2 masts, and a brigantine is a 2-masted vessel, square rigged on 1 mast. So there were 51 ships. I've found 51 ships and 93 brigs and brigantines that were built in those 50 years. And really, they are in fact the peak years of ship production in those yards at Chester, off Crane Street. a lot of the influence and a lot of the orders came from merchants in Liverpool. There were a lot of, obviously a lot more. There was a big shipping community in Liverpool by that time of traders, and everybody called themselves a merchant. They could have been a ship owner, they could have been a plantation owner, they could have been a slave owner, but they called themselves merchants. And a lot of the orders came from Liverpool. And there's the reasons for that are, well, there's several reasons. I think they thought they could get ships, they probably thought they could get ships built at Chester cheaper, because it was always trying to expand. And also, there were big problems in Liverpool as Liverpool developed in the 1820s and particularly 1820, 40, 50, as they were building the docks in Liverpool and expanding the enclosed dock system, the shipyards were driven out, either by the local authority or later by the dock board after 1857, because they wanted the land to build docks and to turn ships round and handle more and more ships. If you had a piece of dock to build a ship on, well, you were never quite sure how long it was going to take to build it. And the dock board and the city council wouldn't give shipbuilders in Liverpool long leases. So, for instance, there was a big outcry in the 1820s where the port authority said, well, you can have a lease for 6 months. Well, that's not much good if you're building a wooden ship. And whereas in Chester, they say, oh, come on, if you want to build a ship, so we'll give you, the city council gave people leases of this land down at the Crane Wharf for 50 years. So it gave them security of tenure. So there are various reasons why it became quite important. And in fact, it's said that in the period before 1820, there were more ships being built at Chester than there were at Liverpool. That's probably true for a little while. But don't run away with the idea that these were big ships. The biggest ship built before 1800 was a ship called the Eurydice, which was very similar to the one on the screen. And she was built as an East Indiaman, spent most of her career trading to the West Indies. But as from a size point of view, I mean, these were the container ships on liner services of the 18th century, but they were incredibly small, really. This ship would have been no more than 100 feet in length in old money. So if you think about it, if you see a trading narrowboat on the canal, that's 70 feet long. So it's 1.5 narrowboats in length and probably 4 narrowboats in beam, to give you some idea of the size. And that was a big ship of that time. So there's another contemporary painting of the sort of ships that were built at Chester. But the interesting thing about this one is that the ship in the far background, which is a brig, or I think, is a brig called the Martha. And this is the only painting I've found of a ship built at Chester in the sailing ship in this period of sailing ship building. She was a brig owned in Liverpool, built in Chester in 1819. Sorry, 1818. I'm giving you different information. But these ships that were built, as I say, they traded all over the world, and two of them, the ship, the John, built in 1810, and the Southworth in 1821, they actually sailed to Australia several times with convicts and emigrants, mainly convicts. So they went everywhere, and they were as I say, the deep sea ships of the day. Now Chester didn't only build merchant ships; it also built some ships for the Navy, and this is quite interesting. William Courtney, who opened the yard, which would have been next to the railway viaduct if it had been there in 1802 in that area. He built 6 ships for the Navy. They weren't big. They were naval sloops and 6th rates. And the one on the left in this picture is a naval sloop called the Levant, and she was built at Chester, I think, in 1804. Now, building naval ships at Chester is quite interesting and caused a lot of trouble. I think Mr. Courtney had worked in a naval shipyard, probably in Plymouth or Deptford or wherever, and he opened this yard at Chester, and he had connections. But the Admiralty were very keen to complain how much it would cost if you built ships outside of Plymouth, Deptford, Portsmouth. You would have enormous costs in fitting them out, because all the equipment to fit them out was in Plymouth, Deptford, or Portsmouth. So, well, all these ships, they built 6 naval ships in between 1804 and 1815, and each one of them was towed to Plymouth for fitting out. Now you think, oh well, that's all right. Well, that seems quite a good idea. But the interesting thing for me is, how did they get them there? First of all, they would have to tow them with another sailing ship or another naval sloop or something, or go down the straightened section of the river at Chester with the ship on tow or on the hip or whatever, alongside another sailing ship with masts and sails and whatever. So that section of the river is narrow, and then they've got to get them all the way around the Welsh coast, round Cornwall, and up to Plymouth. Now this is not an easy task, and of course there were no tugs. We didn't have any steam tugs until about 1820 something, 1825 or 6. We had the first tug on the river. So that's an interesting logistical exercise in itself. Now this picture shows an American frigate, the Constitution, attacking the Levant and one of its sister ships, the Cyane, off Madeira in 1815. And these naval sloops that were built didn't do terribly well. This one was captured. These 2 were captured by the Constitution. The Americans were supporting the French at this time in the Napoleonic Wars, and some of the others were lost in mysterious circumstances. And one, after about 5 years were operating in the Navy, was sunk to see the effects of on putting them in deep water of wood rot, and then salvaged later and rebuilt. But so they weren't terribly successful. But nevertheless, we did build naval ships as well. Of course, as well as building a lot of big ships, we also built. There were lots of the smaller coastal vessels. Now this is a picture of flats. Now the Mersey Flat, as it was known, or the Jigger Flat, the bigger one in the background with the second mast. These were the white van of the coastal waterways of the 18th and 19th centuries. They carried everything everywhere, round the docks, from one ship to another, from one port to another. There were lots of them built, and there was something like 50 odd built were 58 built between 1801 and 1859 on the river at Chester. There might have been a few built on the canal as well, because the Shropshire Union, what became the Shropshire Union Railway and Canal Company's yard on Tower Wharf, also built flats, and some of them did go out on the Mersey. So these were as I say, there were hundreds of these built in all sorts of ports all around the northwest. But so there we go. Right. So Chester didn't just build wooden sailing ships. In the 1830s, or even earlier, actually even earlier, no, 1822, they built the first wooden paddle steamer in Chester. Chester on the Dee was much later than building paddle steamers on other rivers. The Clyde and the Thames, there were wooden paddle steamers built as early as 1814 or 1816. But one of a couple of the builders at Chester both started building wooden paddle steamers in 1822. William Mulvey, who had come to Chester in 1814 and started building ships. He'd earlier built ships down on the Thames and whatever. He built a wooden paddle steamer called the Sir Joseph York in 1822. And another yard run by John Wilson Jr. in the same year produced a ship called the Lord Melville. And she was one of the very early cross-channel steamers, which ran for many years, like 20 odd years. She ran from London, the Pool of London, to Calais, I think 2 or 3 times a week. And she survived from 1822 to 1849, which is remarkable for a early wooden steamer. It may have been re-engined and reboiled a few times, but it's still remarkable. And both the Wilsons and the Mulveys built quite a few paddle steamers for Irish sea services and Mersey ferries. Now, one of the Irish sea steamers, Irish packets, or whatever you want to call them, was the Lee, built by John Wilson Jr. in 1825. And this picture, the picture on the screen now, is a picture of the Victory, which the Wilsons, who were a big Liverpool shipbuilder in these times, that shows the Victory, which Wilson's built, I think, in Birkenhead in 1832. But it's just just shows the sort of what these paddle steamers look like. I believe she's very similar in appearance to the Lee that was built at Chester in 1825. They built quite a few of those. And Mr. Wilson, Mr. John Wilson Jr., is a very interesting person. One of them, because his family, he was only young. He was only in his 20s. He also built big sailing. He built one of the biggest sailing ships at the time, the St. George, big three, an East Indiaman, became an East Indiaman. But Mr. Wilson, they'd opened up in Chester in 1821, and they closed down in 1827 in Chester. They carried on in Birkenhead and Liverpool, particularly Birkenhead. But Mr. John Wilson, he upsticked and left Chester, and he went to live in Newton Abbot in Devon, because his uncle had died, and his uncle was a proprietor of a, I suppose we'd call it now, a quack medicine company, and they made Green's anti-scorbutic drops. So he went. His uncle died, and he went to live there to sell. He was going to make his money selling these patent medicine. However, it was a cure-all. It cured everything. However, he soon sold the business. He started building ships down in Devon, I believe, and after a few years, he was back in Liverpool as a ship registry inspector person, and he became John Wilson Green. Mysteriously, in his absence, he took on the name Green, and he came back and he worked in the ship registry business for the rest of his life until 1880. He got married a couple of times more and whatever. But he was an interesting character. I digress. Now, at the same time, in the 1820s and 30s, William Mulvey, he built a lot of sailing ships, and they were a thriving concern. He wasn't from Chester, but he is buried in Chester Cemetery, and he died in 1839. And the most interesting thing about Mr. Mulvey is that when he died, he had two sons in the business who were shipwrights, and he carried on. He'd built all these wooden ships, but when he died, his wife took over the business. And when you see they carried on building quite big sailing ships for the time, 3-masted ships, square riggers, and it was Peggy who signed the registry certificates when they were finished, not the sons, not the shipwrights. She ran the business, and she carried on doing that for quite a few years. The two sons did take over, but they didn't carry on building big ships. After 1844, they built flats and coastal things, but it petered out after that, really. And the last ship they built in 1844 had a very sad end. The Earl of Chester, that traded until 1867, and then ended up on the rocks at Rossniger in Anglesey with quite a big loss of life. Now, we're getting to the more modern era now. Until 1853, every ship built at Chester was built of wood. But iron had started to come on the shipbuilding scene. And in 1853, the yard at the part of the where the shipyards were, part of the yard, the part next to the railway viaduct, where the racecourse stables are now and whatever, that was taken over or leased from the council by a chap called George Cram. Now, he again is an interesting character because he had been born in Newcastle in 1798. So when he took on this shipyard, he was a merchant living in Chester. His cousin was in shipping, Thomas Cram in Liverpool, and he owned some he was involved in the ownership of some coastal steamers, and he did a lot of ships agency work in Liverpool. But George, when he decided to start going into iron shipbuilding, he was 55 years old. Now, in 1853, that was quite he was an old man, wasn't he? So it's quite an interesting career change, shall we say? And he started out. He converted an iron sailing ship into a steamer. He lengthened it. That was his first attempt at iron shipbuilding in Chester, and this was his second vessel, the Minho. And there's a lovely painting of this in the National Maritime Museum in store. But she was a fine ship, and she was one of the few steamers that actually any marine artist painted. Mr. McGahey, who did a lot of painting in different parts of Britain, lived in Chester for a while. He did this painting. And if any of you may have heard of him, he was a well-known lithographer and so forth. So this was the first iron ship he actually built. Again, she didn't have a long life. 1856, she collided with a big sailing ship off the Straits of Gibraltar and sank immediately. But of course, iron ships would, before the people had really got into iron shipbuilding and understood the provision of a number of bulkheads, iron ships, if they were collided with, would sink very quickly. And she sank with a loss of 88 lives. And she was used on a passenger service between Liverpool and Barcelona. That was her trade. So they went on building ships. But the whole time that George was building ships, he was constantly had money problems. It was never, from the start, he built 12 ships at Chester and another 2 at Sandycroft, which we'll come to in a minute. But he was never financially, the business was never financially viable. I think he'd overexpanded for a start, because no sooner he got the Chester operation up and running that he realized that he couldn't build ships as big as people would like. So he took a lease on a yard at Sandycroft that had been operated by John Rigby as an iron foundry and building wooden vessels there. So because he thought downriver he could build bigger ships, so it was constantly in financial trouble, and eventually by 1857 it had all disappeared into another company called the Rudy Shipbuilding Company. Somehow we don't really understand the machinations of the financial world in that, but he was still involved in the Rudy Shipbuilding at the start, but he was soon out of it and died in penury, living in a cottage in Cumbria. But he built some fine iron ships. This is another one. This is my favorite, this one. This is the Italia. She was built for she was built for a company in Sicily. Now, how he had these connections and these places, I don't know, because he built ships for Spain, Sicily, Holland. I think there was one he built for. And she and her sister vessel, the Sardinia, they were built in 1855 and 1857, and they ran for many years between Naples and Sardinia. That was their trade, and they survived until the 1890s. They even survived being lengthened and re-engined and whatever, and they were good. And the Italia, her claim to fame is that when the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, she was there at the opening and was the first Italian ship to sail through Suez. She's quite an interesting ship. Now, I can't mention, although this strictly isn't at Chester, we can't really mention the fact that Mr. Cram had opened his subsidiary yard or bigger yard at Sandycroft. And this is a picture of the Royal Charter. The Royal Charter being the most famous ship built on the River Dee, or the most infamous maybe. She was built in 1855 and was a splendid example of an early auxiliary screw steamer. We didn't have any paddle wheels anymore. She she was one of the only 2 ships he built at Sandycroft, and she was built for Gibbs Bright, who by this time were operating a very successful service from Liverpool to Australia, specifically Melbourne, carrying emigrants and people wanting to go and enjoy the gold rush. And she was built and intended to be a steam running mate for the Great Britain, which Gibbs Bright had also bought and converted to an auxiliary steamer. As you know, the idea was that the ship operated as a sailing ship, but when there was no wind, you use the engines, and so they were this is pioneering stuff. This she was fitted with a lifting propeller, but of course you all think, oh well, this is George Cram. What a great job he's doing. Except by this time, he didn't build the ship. The ship was taken over in the yard and built and finished by William Patterson, who had actually built the Great Britain for Brunel in Bristol in 1843. So Mr. Patterson, he came up and he sorted it all out. So although it was built in the yard where George Cram was operating, he didn't actually build it. But the lifting propeller is the most interesting thing about that ship, because they found that when the ship was operating, when the Great Britain was operating as a sailing ship, the screw propeller created so much drag, it stopped the ship going as fast as it might do. So they contrived in this vessel, which they built as its running mate, to fit her with this lifting screw, which was done and which worked. So when the ship was out at sea and the wind dropped, the crew were then detailed to go and lift the propeller. Now that's not an easy task in 1850 something, is it? But then no, they did it, and they could do it quite quickly. You know, six hours or something, they were able to lift the propeller. So it worked. And if you go to Bristol today to see the Great Britain, there's a model of the lifting propeller alongside the ship, because she was fitted with one subsequently based on the success of the Royal Charter. Sadly, the Royal Charter, as many of you will know, ran on the rocks coming back from Australia, ran on the rocks off Marlborough in 1859 with very heavy loss of life, and she was the biggest ship ever built on the Dee. She was the biggest ship ever built in North Wales, but sadly she also had the greatest loss of life in peacetime, I think, of any ship on the British coast, unless somebody can tell me of another one. But in peacetime, there were 450 people or so lost on her. It was just an unfortunate accident. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, I think I should be finishing now, really. I think my time is coming up, but I'll just show you. After Mr. Cram went bust, the yard next to the railway viaduct was taken over by the Rudy Shipbuilding Company and was operated by a chap called Nathaniel Cox. The Coxes were iron merchants in Liverpool, and they had good contacts with the shipping community in Liverpool, and they took the yard over and they built 9 magnificent sailing ships. Now, this one is the Gitana, and she was built in 1861, and she was 210 feet long, so she was twice the length of the earlier ship I was talking about, the Eurydice, built in 1797. So we've doubled the length of the ships in that time, in 100 years. being built at Chester, because of course the river isn't that wide at this location. They were launched from the yards there, or from the slipways there, with the stern pointing towards the sea direction. But nevertheless, there were a number of ships that did stick and did ground on the bank opposite and rip the rudder off and things like that. There was one of the accidents that happened from time to time. But they built 9 of these ships. But again, was never financially very successful. And Mr. Cox, he managed the business from a distance. He had an estate. He lived on an estate in Tywyn in mid Wales, and he was never available when he was always in ill health when the launchings took place. He sort of didn't turn up to see anybody, which is not surprising as it was so far away. And he went bankrupt eventually. That he didn't last too long. This was in 1867. At the same time, in the 1850s, we were still building wooden ships at Chester as well. A firm called, an operation called variously William Bishton. He built wooden schooners. He built 20 odd wooden two-masted and two-masted, three-masted schooners at Chester, mostly for use by people for trade from the River Dee. They were built for people carrying coal and bricks from and pottery, things like that, from Buckley. They were built for some of the clay product owners, and they carried on. But in 1870, shipbuilding at Chester finished, and the last ship built at Chester was a ship called the Balogun, which was built, had I think been started by the Mr. Bishton and his manager William Parks, but it was finished being built by a firm called Allsops from Preston, who built a lot of wooden ships up in Preston. So whether she was finished at Chester or whether she was launched at Chester and then taken up to Preston to finish off, I don't know. But in 1870, commercial shipbuilding in Chester finished. Now you might say, oh, well, what about the other people? But there were the only other yards who built near Chester was Crichton's at Saltney, who operated from 1813 until from 1913, I should say, until 1935, and they built ships of all types. And I'll just show you, this is one of the ships built at Saltney, which was a ferry for use in Australia. The Karakara has the distinction of being bombed by the Japanese when she was in Darwin during the Second World War. 2 of her crew were killed. And then there's also, they built lovely they built river steamers and a lot of tugs, whatever. This is the Quebrador, which they built for use in Buenos Aires. She was still there in the 1970s because I sent a friend of mine to find her. And the actual last commercial vessels built on the Dee were these barges built at Queensferry in 1940 to 42. And they were barges built in concrete for use for grain storage. When the Blitz was on in Liverpool, the idea was you took the grain out of the ships, took the grain away from the docks and anchored it in the river in one of these barges, which they did do. So that really sort of brings us to the end of the shipbuilding thing. It's just to finish, I'll say I've found 475 commercial and naval vessels built at Chester, that were worthy of registration since 1750. Of course, there's over 1,000 if you take in the whole of the River Dee, but 475 built at Chester, and of every type imaginable. And they sail to every corner of the world. A lot of people have the idea that, oh, well, the Dee, it's narrow, it's shallow, etc., etc. They must only be coasters. They weren't. There's a lot of deep sea ships of the time. And of course, researching them leads you on to all sorts of other things, which would justify a talk in themselves. This picture, which I started the talk with, this shows the cheese stage. As I say, Mr. Mulvey and Mr. Wilson built 4 cheese ships because although people perhaps don't realize, there was a whole business of moving cheese from Chester and from the Humber to London, run by an organized group of cheese merchants, and they were known as cheese ships. So what they did, all kinds of goods that came from overseas were carried by these 2-masted brigs, schooners, whatever, were carried from London to the provinces by these ships, and then you returned your cargo. Your return cargo was cheese from Chester, or well, there was some from Liverpool as well, but they were cheese. That's what the cheese stage was for. So they're an interesting sort of spin-off I found out about. The Royal Charter, the people who own the Royal Charter, they're an interesting company as well, Gibbs Bright, because not people don't know much about them. So that's another interesting subject to explore. And they owned the Great Britain. And then, of course, I've mentioned some of the builders. They had very interesting careers. We had Peggy Mulvey, who was one of the very unusually a woman running a shipbuilding, unheard of. So there's all sorts of avenues to explore from there, which I hope to do when the records offices are open and available to us again. But I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Richard. That was well, fascinating. I've read the book, and it's there's so much more information that you've got and knowledge. It's fantastic. Everyone's on
I should have said, of course, there may be some questions.
Yes, I was going to say yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right. Okay. Right.
Okay, but
if anyone wants to ask questions, fire away.
Richard,
sorry, come.
Richard, could I ask you a question about the materials? Were these boats built exclusively of oak, and the wooden boats? And where did the oak come from? And the steel boats or the iron boats, where did that material come from?
There's always somebody who asks a good question, isn't there?
I was going to ask that one.
The oak, yes, I think a lot of oak was used, but I don't think they were entirely oak. And as I say, like one or two those naval vessels that were built, they obviously had big rot problems within a few years of being constructed. So whether people tried various other softwoods and whatever, I mean, of course, it's well known that in later years, there were lots of cheaper sailing ships built on the east coast of Canada, were all built of softwood and didn't last too long and had to be replanked very soon after being built. But I think a lot of the oak I think it came from North Wales, and that was one of the reasons why like the southern part of the country, certainly the areas near the naval ports, had run out of oak, and that's probably why those naval ships were built at Chester. But certainly I know of oak. There were if you look at the newspapers at the time, there were always people selling oak, probably hoping to sell it to shipbuilders, you know. And there was a firm called a family called the Dixons who lived in Chester. They owned a lot of timber. They had owned a timber yard during the early part of the 19th century and the late 18th, and they actually used to import some of it from Canada. But I think mostly it was oak. Yeah, it's somewhat allegedly, and I'd like to see it done. Some of this was floated down the Dee from places like Bangor-on-Dee and Overton and whatever, because there was, you know, it was rafted, allegedly. I wouldn't like to have been going the other way on a boat when it came down the Dee, but there you go. And the iron, yeah, I too have wondered about this, because there was an iron foundry on the site, but it doesn't appear to have particularly been involved in the shipbuilding. The smaller, where the plates came from and whatever, I don't know. Maybe they came by rail in the later, but I don't know, is the answer to your question.
Thank you.
It is a puzzle, but some of it must have come from Liverpool, I think, because, as I say, Mr. Cox, when he got involved in the Rudee ship, he was an iron merchant, so he probably supplied it. Whether they could have brought it round in coasters, couldn't they? Sailing ships, I don't know.
When did John Summers start in Queensferry?
Sorry?
When did John Summers start in Queensferry? Because it could have come from there.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, John Summers didn't start until I think that started about 1902.
Oh, I thought it was earlier than that.
No, it's much later.
Oh, okay.
But there were, you've got to remember, there was lots of, there were lots of iron foundries in the West Midlands. There were lots of iron foundries in North Wales, Brumbo.
Yeah.
And what's the other place? Kevin Mauer. You know, maybe some of the plates came in canal boats. I don't know, but they wouldn't. They're hardly big enough, were they? The other interesting thing, which I've not come across, which I've sort of looked for, is when they started iron shipbuilding in Chester on that site, the noise must have been horrendous. And I'm surprised the residents weren't up in arms, you know. I mean, all the hammering and riveting, shearing, all times of cutting. Oh, the noise must have been terrible. There were because it was a big enterprise, and when one of the times when Mr. Cram couldn't pay the wages, the newspaper said that 1,100 people would be thrown out of work. I mean, it was a big, you know, of its time. It was quite a big enterprise, but only briefly. You know, that's the problem. I think a lot of the people too weren't local. They sort of shipwrights moved around. They'd come from Liverpool or from some other port. I mean, most of the wooden shipbuilders who started in Chester, they'd all worked somewhere else. They tried to do operations in Pwllheli or London or Lancaster or wherever. So they didn't come from Chester particularly.
What about the sails? I mean, did they have were they sort of brought in or were they made? Because they'd need a big area to stretch them out, wouldn't they?
There were. I mean, there were sail makers and rope makers in Chester, I think. I don't know who specifically the sail makers were, but I think there must have been. Otherwise, it would have come from Liverpool, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And,
when you walk on the walls, they say there's an area.
Yes.
Isn't there where they did the ropes? And
near the Bridge of Sighs, yes, along there, yeah. And I think there was another rope walk down on the site down at Crane Wharf.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question, Richard. What about for the steamships? Where did the engines come from? Were they? I mean, did they use the foundry? You say the foundries weren't used for, particularly involved with the shipbuilding. So where did the engines fall?
Yeah. Now the engines, none of them came from Chester. The steam engines, they were some of them like I know the Royal Charter. The engines were made by John Rennie in London, or Penn. Sorry, was it? No, John Penn, sorry, was the engine builder. They came from London, and the engines came from all over the place. There were some engine builders in Liverpool, so some of them came from there, but they came from anywhere and everywhere. They didn't come from Chester. So I don't know. I think quite a few of them, they must have got them to Liverpool in another. They must have got them to Chester in another ship. I think. I mean, when we're talking about the foundries and where the iron came from and the plates, the foundries in the West Midlands did have a strong connection by the when would that be? The 1850s, 60s. They did have a strong connection with Saltney because the iron ore, they imported iron ore in sailing coasters from Cumbria, and it was brought to Saltney and put on a train and went to the West Midlands. So there might be a connection there, you know, that with that sort of thing, how it moved inland. But how you'd move bits of engines round at that time is an interesting question.
Yep. Richard, may I ask a question, please? Sadly, I missed the first little bit of the talk. There was a bad connection, but I'm looking now at the lovely painting of Chester with the ships on the D.
Yes.
And I'm trying to place where that is in Chester. I recognise the cathedral. So where's the view?
Right. So if you've been to the retail park, down Sealand Road, and you you come out onto Sealand Road and you turn left and you're coming into Chester. You've got I think it's a Land Rover garage on the right.
Yes, I think I'm with you.
And that is where that corner is. There's a very sharp turn in the river at that point where it was straightened. This is almost looking upriver. From the back of that Land Rover garage.
I'm with you.
And this is on the corner. That the cheese stage on the left is in the corner.
Good Lord.
And Sealand Road is just over to the left.
It's changed a bit.
Is that that little park called the Cop?
Yes, there's a little park. Yes.
Yeah,
that's right. On the right, and then you come along, and you can't see in this picture the canal where the canal joins the river, or used to join the river.
That's fascinating.
And that's where it all was. And as I say, there wasn't a lot of, in the period I've been talking about, there wasn't a lot of other activity in the port of Chester. There was some traffic up to the mills up by the weir and whatever, but this part there was very little activity, I think, other than the shipbuilding that I've been talking about.
Fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about your book, because I'm very interested in buying a copy?
Well, it's no longer it. I've sold them all. Right.
Can we get one from the library, I wonder?
Yes.
It is available in the records office and the library.
What's it called?
Interesting. It's called Ships of the Chester River.
Yeah.
And if you want to buy one,
Yeah.
I haven't got any because they've all gone. But I think if you go to the Grosvenor Museum,
Yes, which I know well.
when it's open, or if it's open, the shop in the Grosvenor Museum, I suspect has still got some.
Right, I'll have a look. Thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed that. Shame I missed the first bit, but never mind.
Well, no. Well, you know, you'll cope.
I'll cope. Yeah.
I was in Goredale Garden Centre beginning of last week, and they had some 2 or 3 copies there.
Are there?
Yeah.
The where? Sorry.
Goredale Garden Centre on the
Where's
Right.
that? Never heard of it.
Are they open?
Oh,
No.
Goredale, I think, has been open all through lockdown.
yes,
Just
it's open.
before
now.
you get to Ness.
Yes.
How did they get away with it?
Well, all the garden centres are
All the
open.
garden centres are open.
Oh, are they?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
You know
sorry,
that.
I thought they
The
were shut.
cafes aren't. The cafes aren't.
No.
Gardening is an essential
Last time.
Oh, excellent. Well,
pastime.
I can go and get some of the hanging geraniums then. Good for my bathroom.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, they'll definitely have them.
You can go and get a new coat at Grosvenor if you like, Sheila. They're having a sale of outdoor clothing.
Oh, lovely.
Nice price too.
Affordable now. Then.
Oh no, I really thought
Okay.
they'd have to shut. Oh right, okay, fair enough.
Would they have taken wood from Delamere, or would that have been too far and it's not the right sort of wood?
They may well have done. I think a lot of the big estates around Cheshire and North Wales supplied timber.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's where most of it came from. As I say, whether it, some people say some of it was floated down the river, but that, I don't know. It may have been put in a barge and brought down the river, because they took barges up and down the river over the weir at high tide.
Yeah.
And there was, funnily enough, I mean, I don't know, it's not sort of something I've looked at, but there was a boat building business at Bangor-on-Dee. And because the Duke of Bridgewater, who some of you will know, built the Bridgewater Canal for his coal mines and whatever at Worsley, some of the barges were built at Bangor-on-Dee and somehow got to the Bridgewater Canal. I assume they must have been, they were built there. And there's a chap whose name escapes me, who's written an article about this, and it's in the boat museum at Ellesmere Port. They produce the Waterways Journal. That's what I'm looking for the name of. Well, one of the most recent ones. Again, when you can go to the boat museum or whatever it is for sale in there, but I haven't got it. But a chap has written an article all about that, and I assume that would also talk about where the timber came from. But I haven't seen that yet.
Richard, Linda sent us a message, a chat out, a question. She's saying, do you think they towed new built ships down the river off the bank at first?
I was just wondering maybe if they had teams of horses, Richard, before they got steam tugs, certainly down as far as Connors Quay or something.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of that.
No.
I mean, I suppose anything is possible, but I somehow don't think so. I think it was you waited for the wind to be blowing in the right direction.
Right.
I don't think there was. I'm not aware of it.
I suppose they could have gone with the tide as well, couldn't they?
Yes, yes, they could. Yeah, let's say they waited for the tide or whatever. And of course, these it's quite interesting when they built the Royal Charter at Sandycroft. Of course, she was much bigger than any other ship had been built. I mean, I was saying the Gitana built at Chester was 210 feet long. The Royal Charter was 340 something feet long. And of course, when they tried to launch it, they couldn't. They tried twice. Thousands of people walked from Chester to see it launch and were disappointed. And they eventually got it. They eventually dug their way into the river at low tide and got it off. But even when they towed her to Liverpool, because we had steam tugs by then, when they towed her to Liverpool, it still went aground halfway down on the mud banks lower down off Moston, sort of thing. So as you say, you probably would go with the tide to some extent.
Thank you.
To get out. It was
an interesting talk, and
it's a big problem. But I don't know. I've never come across anything about towing ships before tugs. But it's a point they may well have done. You could almost do it until you met a ship coming the other way. Of course, and it's a bit dodgy.
Thank you.
Right. Well, it's what's it? Nearly 1:45. I guess we ought to be.
Can I just mention, Richard? You did mention something about other subjects you could talk about, other options.
Well, no, I wasn't.
You wasn't making an offer. Fair enough.
No,
okay.
No, I wasn't. But I need to do some more homework.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
I haven't done my homework.
There's just a little bit about the cheese ship. I don't know if you're aware, but Cheshire cheese is the only one that's mentioned in the Doomsday Book.
Is it really? Good Lord.
So I gather.
Oh, well, now that's interesting.
The only one that's mentioned by name.
Right.
Well, so it must have been a big thing, even when was that written? Around 1080 something?
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah.
So it must have been quite a thing even then.
Well,
it to be mentioned.
Well, if we're trading fascinating facts, right. There was a period in the. I
don't know if you're aware of it.
I'm not. No, I wasn't. I'm always grateful for bits of odd information. No, it's also interesting that when the cheese thing, when I started finding out about these cheese ships, I can't remember the year now, so don't hold me to that. But let's say in 1730 or something, or maybe a bit later, the Navy issued a decree that only Cheshire cheese was to be supplied to their ships. Other forms of cheese were found wanting and crumbly, whatever, and that sort of lasted for about 50 years, I understand. But so I think some of this business with these ships and going to London, I think they must have taken cheese. They probably took it direct alongside some ship in Deptford, or whatever, or to the store to Greenwich or whatever, and put it ashore for the Navy. But it's interesting that I'm sure that must have been one of the drivers for the cheese ship business. But it is quite interesting.
Perhaps it was a set standard for Cheshire cheese, whereas other cheeses hadn't achieved that state, as it were.
Yeah,
and
maybe
they could be relied upon.
Yeah, maybe the European Commission had approved it.
We won't.
But of course, cheese was for your 18th century or 19th century sailing ship working for the running for the Navy. You know, it was a wonderful commodity, wasn't it? You know, because it would last for years. You could use it as ballast because it's so heavy. You know, it's great. Although the cheese ships used to go down to Flint and load lead for ballast. So it's even heavier. But it's very interesting. It'd be a wonderful commodity. You can live on it forever, can't you? The fact that it's a bit mouldy and there's things crawling out of it. Well,
cut them off.
Yeah. Well, there we go.
Okay. Right. Well, thanks very much, Richard. I think
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
that really was interesting. When you're looking at the size of these ships when they were first being built, 100 feet long, and they sailed all around the world, this brings that home to you know what I mean. Would you like anyone like to sail across the Atlantic on a 100-foot sailing ship?
Yeah, no, well, that's it, isn't it?
You know, so yeah, but the sight of but then the sight of those big ships, you know, the big one from Saltney going down down the Dee, that must have been something yeah, quite incredible. It probably reminds me where I used to work on the Manchester Ship Canal, and the big in the 1980s when big ships still went up to Manchester. You'd go through Stockton, Heath, and you see these big ships going along the canal, you know, towering above the housing. It was yeah, quite interesting. So yeah, well, thanks very much, Richard. Okay, and let's show our appreciation.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Well, very enjoyable.
Thank you.
Yes, very good. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay.
Come again.
Oh, okay.
I need to do his homework first.